Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.
It's November 16th, beautiful day. We can ski without our anorak, and that's really good. The sun is really strong, and the snow is really sticky. We're climbing slowly, but it's really hard to go still. And we have a beautiful view.
Welcome to this week's edition of Northern Lights. I'm Jerry Zgoda from the Minneapolis Star Tribune, and I'm joined today by Nancy Loewen and Ann Bancroft, authors of the book Fort of the Pole, nominated for a Minnesota Book Award in Youth Literature. It's a book that chronicles Ann's expedition 1992-1993 with three other women from the far side of Antarctica to the South Pole. And it's kind of a preview to a journey you made 7 or 8 years later to Antarctica with Liz Arneson that you probably heard about in the media, and it's one of the reasons I'm sitting here today is I went on the ship that journeyed down to Antarctica to pick Ann up a year ago after their 1,800-mile journey across Antarctica. This book details your first attempt to go through, and the world has changed a lot in exploration and in Antarctic travel in just 7 or 8 short years, didn't it? Back, this book details both with interviews, with the narrative throughout. It also includes transcripts of radio transmissions you made with this big heavy radio you lugged across that didn't always work.
30 pounds.
Yes, and anyone who, if you followed on the website last year, Ann's journey across, you could hear in crystal clear sound daily reports from her tent using a satellite telephone, and the technology has dramatically changed, and the environment has dramatically changed. Back then, you did it on a very shoestring budget, right? With
right.
bake sales and car washes, and now we're sitting in an office that has full-time employees and a relatively big budget. The world can change dramatically in 8 years, can't it?
It sure can. It sure can. It's amazing to have this time frame to be able to measure that kind of change, both in attitudes about what women can do and technology, and then of course my learning curve of understanding. You know, when I got back from this trip in '93, knowing I just didn't have the gumption to be able to do that shoestring budget over, it's about almost a 5-year project at that point to try and put it together to actualize the dream. So, you know, it was also, this change is, for me, looking back and seeing how I've grown and made new attempts for the preparation and the strategy around that.
This last attempt was a little better organized, right? Part of the story from '92, '93 was going down to the ice and not exactly having enough money for the flight, right? And
That's
having
right.
to renegotiate while you were there, while your three traveling partners were outside. Well, I think one of them was kind of muttering, at least one of them was muttering a little under her breath.
Yeah, yeah. It was, those were tough years of making difficult decisions, and not always probably the most sound, but ones that tried to move the project forward, and just relying really on our own goodwill of knowing that we'll come back and we're good for the debt, and of course we were. In 7 years, we ended up paying everyone back. It took us a long time, but we knew we weren't going to desert any one, individual or group, to try and actualize our dream, and that felt good, but some of those decisions were very difficult to make at the time, and you bet my team members were grumbling about that. They were in the dark, actually, to that particular story. But what's nice about this book is that with the help of Nancy, we've been able to bring their voices to the story, because it's not just my story. There were 3 other women, and with the journal entries, it helps bring those other 3 personalities up on the surface as well.
Nancy, how did you decide to structure it like you did? It kind of takes the reader chronologically through the trip, but it includes letters written, it includes copies of radio transcripts, it includes journal entries from everyone, and kind of weaves it all together.
Right. Well, I started out just by reading all of the journals in order to get an idea of, you know, the basic structure of the story, you know, and then I picked and chose what entries I felt best reflected that particular movement in the story. But as for the other information, it was just pretty much all available to me, and I thought that some of that, like the radio transcript, it added another element that wasn't there in the journals. It kind of introduced the idea that, you know, these women were going through this trip, but they were not really going through it alone. There were other people following them, you know, and not just, I mean, anybody, but you know, Ann's sister, you know, and the whole AWE team back here, and you know, there was, I think, a letter from Ann's dad in there that was included in the material, and I just loved that letter so much. It was just a very moving dad kind of thing that I could see, you know, my dad doing, or you know, anybody's dad. And let's see, what else? Oh, like from the newsletters as well. The newsletters, I thought would be a good way to introduce the characters. That was basically why I chose that, because the newsletters did do like an overview of each individual team member and what their strengths were, what they were excited about with the trip, and I thought that would be a good way to not only can introduce the reader to the characters of these women, but just to give an overview of what AWE was all about as well, to kind of put it in a broader context.
Now, speaking of the characters, the last time you went with Liv, both you had resumes. You'd both been to the South Pole before.
Yeah.
How did you find the collection of 4 for the trip a decade ago?
Well, it's such a different makeup. I mean, it's, you know, when I will sit here and say this in this environment, it'll sound kind of silly, but 4 is so much larger logistically and everything else in terms of the blending of personalities than 2. So it's a huge difference to change the number like that. But when you say it, it sounds so silly. I mean, 4 isn't such a huge number, but when you're trying to do all that we're trying to do on the continent, and, you know, that's pulling the sleds all day, you know, for long hours, and doing our routine of tent and just everything that's involved in the trip, you add 4 personalities, and very distinct personalities, as this book points out, and pretty soon you've got a whole nother element to work with. And it's not just the sastrugi or the snowdrifts of Antarctica or the high winds and the ever-changing weather. You've got the ever-changing moods of a particular individual, or not only yourself. And those ebbs and flows on the journey add another dimension of challenge. It's a wonderful challenge, but it is a challenge. And so, you know, one of the things I learned on this trip was that if I wanted to get across Antarctica, I had to continue to pare down my system so that I'm more efficient. And one of the ways to pare down is quite literally to bring your team down to 2. And that allows for us to make decisions very quickly. We're in one tent. We're moving faster all the time. And it's very subtle, but accumulatively, for a 100-day expedition, it makes a huge difference.
Well, you and Liv both knew what you were getting into. I'm
sure
assuming
did.
for all the outdoor activities that you can do, you take 3 people, a couple whom have never been there before, and you put them on this vast expanse with 40 below temperatures. And I noticed even like in the first or second day's diaries, just almost kind of a sense of desperation just from the beginning of just what the conditions were like. Did you sense that as you were, could you feel that as you started to read through the material?
Definitely. It was very compelling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have blisters and cold and...
And in some ways, the beginning is always the big moment, because, you know, you've had that downtime, and on this trip it was in Punta Arenas, waiting to get on that plane, you know, very anxiously waiting. And of course, you're not doing your training at that point. You're needing to be on standby to climb onto that plane when you're, you know, able to get the signal to do so. And that's true for this last trip that Liv and I just did. And you know, it's you never know how you kind of have to warm into Antarctica. And so what you're feeling on those first few pages of those diary entries is just that. And it's a new place for all of us. It was brand new on this AWE trip. And Antarctica is so huge and so magnificent. It swallows you up. And so when you first land on it, it's overwhelming. And you know, then you have all these other factors of warming into the trip, and we just kept telling ourselves, take it slowly, and we've got plenty of time with a long traverse that we'll get there. So. Well,
the first day too, didn't you have to like build a snow brick wall just to protect yourself against the winds?
Oh, it was the winds were howling, and in fact, I almost lost my sleeping bag. Thank Sinova caught it, and we all went chasing after it, and. I lost a hat. I mean, the wind just came out of nowhere, and
you couldn't have bottled that to be used 8 years later.
We
huh?
could have used it.
Now, the plan in 1992 was to cross the continent, correct?
It was. We wanted to traverse.
And you had, as I remember correctly, as you got closer to the South Pole, 6 weeks or a couple months into your journey, you had 2 people probably ready and prepared to go on, and 2 people who probably weren't going to make it just from the physical toll of it.
Yeah.
That had to be a difficult decision to decide. I guess ultimately you decided you were a team, and if the team couldn't go, you weren't going to go.
Yeah. It was a really tough decision. I mean, we had a couple waves of making this decision, and you know, as the story points out, Sinova had a real difficult time with injury, and it was very clear, at least to 3 of us, that she wasn't going to go on. Although it was a struggle for her to become clear about that, and yet, you know, she can hardly walk. But, you know, when passion's involved, you have a bit of denial, and you think, I can do that next 900 miles because I want it so badly. And of course, that just wasn't an option for her. Ann was going up and down emotionally. It was a long journey for her. You know, she had taken other trips, but, you know, on Antarctica, you kind of hunker down and you take care of yourself, even though you are a team. It's very hard to explain that sort of dynamic that needs to take place, but it wasn't a very nurturing environment for her as we all kind of hunkered down and sort of survived. We would take care of each other if needed, but there's a huge expenditure of energy if you need to do that. And that was the difficult part for Ann, I think, and with a little tendinitis thrown in there and a very arduous trip, you know, her psyche was up and down. It was a bit roller coastery. And for me, that was a signal to question the next 900 miles for her, knowing that time was tight and we really had to really go at the next part of the traverse, the second half, with sort of a vengeance and in order to make it. And so I was really questioning her readiness to be able to do that. And of course, our whole camp system is made for 2s. We have 2 tents, 2 kettles, 2 sleeping, you know, it's all made for pairs. And if you have 3, you suddenly have a real issue with weight and equipment. Mm-hmm. So when I looked at the second half and the possibilities of going on, I really looked at Sue and myself as being those 2 people, and Ann and Sinova going out at the pole. Well, of course, that was a very difficult conversation to have a week or so, 10 days before the South Pole, before reaching that really wonderful place, to look Ann in the eye and say, I'm questioning your readiness for the second half. And of course, she knows everything about the logistics and the weight and those kinds of things. So she knows the dilemma that were in with a number of 3 and what that meant. But it would be right before the South Pole that it really became apparent that we needed to focus just on getting to the pole first. And we wanted to do that as a team. And that's where 4 to the Pole came into play. It became our mantra. It was our chant that we are going to get to the bottom of the world together. And we're not going to evacuate Sinava. And we thought about it very seriously because her health was deteriorating. And, you know, obviously these goals are not worth permanent injury or death in our minds. And so it was a difficult decision and a risky one to say, look, let's rally around. Let's not worry about the traverse now and the time pressure. Let's focus on the pole and getting there as a team. And then at the pole, we would make that final decision, and probably the hardest decision of my life to date, of saying, I too am going to turn back from my passion with Sue, and we'll all go out together. That it wasn't, for a litany of reasons, appropriate for us to go on at that point.
But that decision set the stage for 7 years later. How
Sure
quickly after that decision was made, and either after you left the ice or maybe not left the ice, did you start thinking about the next try?
I started strategizing the next try while I was at the South Pole. And I have notes, you know, writing down if I went with 2, and of course I didn't know who that second person would be, but I had already made that determination that the number 2 was the right number to pull sleds and ski across Antarctica. And I believed it was so possible, and I knew it at the South Pole. Now having that 67-day experience behind me, I knew I could do this personally, and I knew it was achievable to drag a sled 2,400 miles across this continent. And so I started scribbling the strategies to try and do that. It wouldn't be for 7 years till I gave myself permission to articulate that dream because of the debt and wanting to focus on climbing out of that.
8 years ago, school children followed along as you and the other 3 went to the South Pole. 8 years later, we would guess millions more followed along by something called the internet, which came along in the meantime.
Yeah.
And children everywhere, I think in 46 different countries, followed your trip last winter, including some from the Zgoda public schools.
Hi, I'm Maggie Miller. We are 8th grade students from Zgoda West Middle School.
I'm Katie Homer, and last year we did a statewide History Day project on Ann Bancroft.
I'm Laura Rooney, and what inspired us most was that it was 2 women that trekked across Antarctica, which had never been done before, and it was a very original and interesting topic for us to do. We had a couple questions to ask you. What was your biggest sacrifice while trekking across Antarctica?
Oh, that's such a hard question. It's, I think there's always a bit of sacrifice in a certain sort of way, oddly enough, because you're doing something you love. I say oddly enough, in the time away. I mean, you know, you leave home, and so you're missing things here, particularly related to family.
And that's not just a week or 2, that's 4 months, right?
Yeah, it was close to 5 months by the time we get home. And you know, I've got a little niece and nephew that you know, I'm very hooked into, and I could sense, you know, how you see how kids grow so quickly. So I was acutely aware that I was missing things here, and yet, you know, clearly this was my choice to be gone, and I loved every minute of the time that I had on Antarctica, even during the tough times. So, you know, it's because it is such a passion-driven thing, I did not find as much difficulty as most people imagine from being down there. But I'm always, you know, missing home.
YourExpedition.com, we miss you. And I bet you don't miss us.
What was the hardest part, and did you ever feel like giving up?
You know, I never wanted to give up on this trip. I had second thoughts on the AWE trip. On this trip, you know, I got frustrated, but oftentimes it was because I was so exhausted And usually a good night's sleep, you know, I felt like a new day the next day, and I was raring to go. But I never felt like giving up. It never got so desperate, and I think it had a lot to do with the way in which Liv and I got along. We supported each other so completely, and it wasn't always verbal, but you know, you always knew that she was there and that she'd stand by you, and so it never got to such a despair that, you know, you felt like packing it up.
What was the scariest part of your adventure? Did you have any doubts or fears?
Now, I know one day you're dragging a 250-pound sled behind you, and you're about 5'3" and 120 pounds, and you actually flew one day. I don't know if that was the scariest part, but...
That was scary, though. Being Mary Poppins, I call that. The sails pulled me up. That wasn't actually my scariest moment. I think was probably when I thought I lost Liv, and my sail had come unhooked from my harness. We were both sailing, and it was a very white day. The snow was all kicked up and swirling around in the air, and I couldn't see Liv if we got far apart very well. And when my sail unhooked, I yelled at her, and she saw it, and she took chase after it, and she disappeared into the white. And it took me about a half hour to get up to her sled, pulling without the sail, getting up to her gear. And I looked all around, and she was still not back from chasing my sled. And I didn't know which direction to look for her in. I knew which way the wind was going, so I figured that's where my sail went, but there were no tracks anymore. They were dusted away. And I thought, losing a sail is not worth losing Liv over. And my heart just sunk in my, you know, I just felt like the bottom went out. And, you know, I knew I couldn't go out. I needed to stay. My best line of defense for her was to stay with the gear until I could, you know, unless it really got grave. And sure enough, she came in out of the white, you know, carrying my sail, which was amazing in and of itself. But there she was with white all over her face. And I, you know, I thought, you know, I can handle anything. We can lose sails, we can run out of food, but I can't lose this friend.
Since you've returned, this book is from the 92-93 expedition. I understand you've been working on a book yourself about last year's expedition. How does it go with the pen instead of the sled?
Well, the pen is a lot harder than the sled, I will say. And this book is really a beacon for me. And as Nancy knows, that this is something, you know, I've wanted to tell this story for a long, long time. And the reason this book is a beacon is because it finally happened. It was actually supposed to be published before I left for Antarctica a second time, and it, you know, as schedules go, things get put behind, and to come back from Antarctica a second time and feel this hardback and see our names on the front, and to know that that story's out there, particularly for a young audience, is really a big deal for me, and it gives me the inspiration to stay in the chair with the pen as Liv and I write this second story, because it's also a continuation. You know, no story is all by itself. There's stories that go before Four to the Pole, and you know, the North Pole is one of those stepping stones for me, and then Four to the Pole, and of course this trip with Liv. So you know, I know in my heart of hearts how important it is to have the story down on paper, to share it. But it's a difficult endeavor. I have all my respect goes to Nancy for doing the really hard work and helping to get this story on the page.
Any advice for a would-be writer?
Well, the main thing is to read. I think every writer will say that. Every writer is a reader as well, and to read not just stuff that you're interested in writing, but everything. I mean, just have a good, well-versed background in you know, read poetry now and then, or if you tend to read fiction, read some nonfiction. You know, if you like writing picture books, read picture books, but also read some, you know, adult art books or something. I think that's the main thing. But more specifically, it's a tough thing to do. I mean, the blank page is terribly frightening. I think most writers say that. But to just kind of be patient, and I think the biggest piece of advice I would have for people interested in writing is to understand that writing is a process, and that it's not something that you're going to do. It's not going to come out brilliantly the first time. It's a draft by draft.
Is that true?
Yeah.
Well, nothing
you
for me comes out
note.
perfectly the first time.
So now, in 2 months from when we tape this, which will be May of 2002, you're going to attempt another adventure, but it's not going to be snow and cold and sleds. It's going to involve water and paddles and 5 bodies of water in the North America called the Great Lakes.
Yeah, yeah. It's most people sort of slot us in as they know us, as they get to know us by these polar trips, as individuals who only have a focus on the polar regions. And Liv and I also love to paddle. I mean, I grew up in Minnesota, and you're born in a canoe practically, and much like the Norwegians are born with skis on, and Liv's a kayaker, so this is not a huge departure for us. But what I think is really fun is that our last trip a year ago on Antarctica was inspired by a book. And this Great Lakes adventure is also inspired by a book. This happens to be a children's book that was read to me as a young girl by my mother. It's called Paddle to the Sea. And as Nancy talked about, the best advice is to be a reader. Liv and I love to read, and it doesn't surprise us that our 2 adventures together are inspired by books, because books have always held adventure for the 2 of us, whether they're literal adventures that we want to partake in or not. Between the hardcover is, it's a place to take your mind on all sorts of adventures, and so it's really wonderful that we're inspired by stories that inspire us to take action, and then to come full circle and actually write about the stories that we embark on. To bring it full circle back to a book is really fun. So yeah, we're looking forward to May coming and paddling just north of here in a little bit warmer weather. It's May, so it's not going to be all, sun, and it'll be just a lot of fun.
And with that discussion of books, we wrap up this edition of Northern Lights.
Thanks.
Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.